So everybody, thank you for joining us here tonight. If you don't know me, my name is Brooke Alford. I'm past president of Central Chapter and INPS, as well as chair of the DEIJ Committee, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice. Our partner hosting us tonight also is through my day job at Purdue Extension, where I'm the urban ag and natural resources educator, and they co-support these presentations on a monthly basis. So thank you for being here. Tonight, Sharon Selvaggio, Pesticide Program Specialist at the Xerces Society, will discuss why choosing pollinator-safe nurseries is important and how plant buyers can evaluate nursery practices. She will also introduce Xerces' model for obtaining pollinator-safe native plants in quantity. Tiny, inconspicuous, and unappreciated species hold our world together. On their behalf, Sharon, a staff member in the Xerces Society's pesticide program, works to help people recognize the risks of pesticides and move away from pesticide reliance towards more prevention-based pest management. Sharon is a former biologist and refuge manager at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and prior to Xerces, worked for several years with Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Sharon. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, as we all know that this is a growing concern in the work that we do. And we appreciate you being here to educate us further so, we can help, provide some of that impact where we're at.
Thank you. So Brooke, I need to show my screen again, right? It's showing up on my, is my screen showing? I thought
It's not showing right now.
Oh, okay. So this is odd. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Take a moment. I need to let folks know also that while Sharon is presenting tonight, please feel free to enter any questions in the chat, and we'll wait till the end of the presentation to address those, unless you may have some kind of a clarifying question in which we just need to gently interrupt Sharon to get some clarity on that.
Oh, I'm sorry, because I think I lost my taskbar somewhere here by minimizing, and okay, maybe, okay.
Maximizing
Okay. Sorry about that. Sometimes
okay.
When you have like something that looks exactly like what Zoom normally looks like, but anyway, I won't make excuses for myself.
Oh, that's okay. I've had the taskbar just disappear on me completely before. So, I think right now, yeah, if you just put it in presenter mode, you're ready to go. Everybody can see that beautiful photograph.
Yeah. So here we go.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Does that look right?
Yes. It looks perfect. Yes,
great.
Absolutely.
So, hello, everybody. I am excited to talk to the Indiana Native Plant Society. I actually have some roots in Indiana, although I live in Oregon now, but I'm a Midwesterner. I grew up in Chicago. My grandmother actually was born and raised in Danville, Indiana. I tried to go to the University of Notre Dame. They wouldn't let me in because at the time they accepted very few girls. And they told me that I had to be like so much better than the boys to even get in because they only had so much housing, which, I've never forgotten all these years. But I could have ended up going to college in Indiana. Instead, I started out at Northwestern in Chicago, and then I ended up moving to California and finishing at the University of California and basically becoming a Westerner. But I remember my summers in Indiana very well, both living with my grandmother and my dad. And so I found this picture from the Indiana dunes, and it just brought back those forests in Indiana, those beautiful hardwood forests, and just the lovely humid heat of the summer. So let's talk about plants. So I am a pesticide specialist, as Brooke said, and we've been talking about this topic for a while, but let me tell you a little bit about our organization first. We are an organization, a nonprofit that focuses on conservation of invertebrates. I like to tell people that it's kind of like Audubon, but we focus on insects and other invertebrates. And that's protecting the life that sustains us, because without these little things that actually run the world, we would not be here today, able to eat food, able to enjoy clean water. We wouldn't be able to enjoy all those other things that insects give us, birds, and all of that. We were started by Robert Michael Pyle, who was sort of a butterfly biologist, and were named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which is shown in this picture. It was actually native to the dunes south of San Francisco, or in and around San Francisco. And as San Francisco grew, I think in the 1940s, this poor little butterfly went extinct. It was the first butterfly that was ever driven extinct by development. So they inspired this butterfly, along with many others that are vulnerable, inspire us to do our work in pollinator conservation, endangered species conservation, and reducing pesticide use and impacts, because that's a major threat to the native biodiversity of insects around the world. Just to kind of continue on the theme of sort of this broad suite of invertebrates that we think about as we do our work, we show just 8 different wildly beautiful species here that provide pollination, decomposition and recycling services, purification of water, and free pest control, something that we think about a lot in our program. And so these species that I show here play one or more of these roles. I forgot to say, but we are a national organization, and I have a dear colleague who also lives in Indiana. Some of you may know her, Stephanie Frischi. We collaborate quite a bit. We were on the phone today, in fact. And so if any of you know Stephanie, anyway, she's, as I said, a dear colleague, and I've learned so much from her. And a lot of what we've worked on, what I'm going to talk about today, Stephanie and I worked on together along with some of our other colleagues at Xerces. So just wanted to throw that in there. But so today I'm going to talk about the opportunity that's in front of us. I'm going to give a little background about what we know about whether plants are safe now, nursery plants in general. And then I'm going to go to solutions and talking about approaching local nurseries and how to do that. The opportunity that we have, that I see at least, is that we've got native plant advocates such as yourselves all across the country who have pointed out the superior ecological value, pest resistance, and hardiness of native plants. And so more and more organizations, even including municipalities, this is Lafayette, Indiana, departments of transportation, campuses, restoration groups, and even landscaping companies are starting to heed the call to restore pollinator habitat in communities across the country. And so that's leading to a demand for local, native, and safe plants, which has never been higher. We see pollinator habitat restoration just taking off in cities and campuses across the country. And here's just a few examples. There's the program Bee City USA and Bee Campus USA, you may know about, was started by a woman out in North Carolina named Phyllis Stiles. And she came to Xerces when she was close to retirement to basically give her baby, this Bee City USA program, a good home. And so we took it on. Phyllis worked for us a few more years, and this has just kind of grown like wildfire. So this shows people across the country putting in pollinator habitat, or the results of it, like this home residence in Chicago, and someone's front yard in Chicago. What's needed for all of this work? A robust supply of pollinator-safe native plants. I'm going to be emphasizing this concept of pollinator safety today, because when we think about the quality of forage for bees and plants for butterflies, we have to obviously have the native species that they evolved with. We have to have that diversity out there to support the diversity of pollinators. But knowing what we know about how ubiquitous pesticides are throughout our country, and in every kind of plant production, crops, obviously, but including nurseries, the issue of safety has, become kind of central to this whole concept, because we want to be able to put out plants that don't contain, residues of pesticides that are actually toxic to the pollinators that are going to feed on them. So this is part of how we approach this work. So purchasing plants to create habitat within parks and public spaces is, part of the process for creating pollinator habitat. Some people divide and share or collect local seed and share, but ultimately, even with seed, like that has to be propagated. And so purchasing plants is just a huge part of it. But that means that we have an opportunity, because large buyers, especially when large buyers collaborate with other large buyers, that creates leverage and purchasing power, joint purchasing power for procurement. And what we've been starting to do and to see and to talk to people about is, if we start all using contract grows where we can, to ensure pollinator-safe plants with, the right contract specifications as part of that, this is a way to leverage our purchasing power and use it wisely. So I'll discuss the mechanisms of that in a minute, but let's look at a little bit of why this might be a good idea for pollinators. So going to that question, are plants safe now? Well, we know, first of all, that when pollinators contact pesticides one way or another, they can uptake pesticides. And that can happen if they're out there when a spray occurs, so they can get sprayed over their bodies directly, what we call topical, when it sort of contacts the exoskeleton. They can also come along after a spray has occurred, like a bee could visit a flower that might have been sprayed the day before and still get a dose. Also topically, or they might consume the residues that have been left on the flower material or on the leaf. And sometimes that residue comes not from the spray that is on the surface of the plant or the flower or the pollen, but it can come from within the plant, because so many pesticides are used systemically now, which means that the chemical is applied in a way that it gets inside the plant and gets transported around the plant. And so consuming residues on and in plant material through oral ingestion is a big mechanism that we think a lot about. And then there's even, as you know, a lot of beneficial insects do pollinate through, different stages of their life. Excuse me, it's a little bit late. I'm like a little tired today, but when they might consume insect prey as adults, as larvae, and then pollinate as adults. So hoverfly being an example, they can consume actually contaminated prey and can receive a dose that way. So when we think about pollinator-safe plants that we're going to buy from a nursery and we are going to take out into our yard or plant in our community, in a pollinator garden, or do a restoration project, we want to take steps to protect those plants and ultimately the pollinators that are going to visit the plants from these. When we think about getting a plant and transporting it to a different place, it's probably that second and third, those mechanisms that are the most important. So have residues been applied recently enough that pollinators that might visit shortly after we put it into its new home might actually pick up a toxic dose topically? Or might they consume residues that are really on the plant, or especially inside the plant tissue, that might have been applied sometime before and might be available for some time? So these are the things that we're thinking about as we think about plant materials that we're buying and what is the risk for pollinators subsequently. We don't have a lot of studies that have looked at pesticide residues of nursery plants sort of across different kinds of species and in different locations, but the few that we do have show that we can't assume that plants are safe. And We know this partly through studies of residues directly. We also know this through, in Xerces at least, we talk to a lot of commercial nurseries and we've looked at studies, and most commercial nurseries and greenhouses do use pesticides on the plants that they produce. It varies tremendously from nursery to nursery, but it's not uncommon to find insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Whether a nursery takes steps to use, safer chemicals is entirely their decision. There's a wide range of pesticides that are allowed in the nursery trade, and it's sort of just up to the nursery to decide, what their boundaries are going to be. But from the existing studies available, we do see that typically nursery plants contain lots of residues. Usually a sample of a recently bought nursery plant contains multiple pesticides in the same tissue. We also see that sometimes residue loads are at levels that are high enough to kill bees. This usually comes from a couple of highly toxic insecticides, but there's a lot that's not known about how pesticides interact. And so we worry about when we've got high levels, but also when we've got multiple different pesticides, because that's so, first of all, it's unregulated, and secondly, it's not very well studied what that means. As I mentioned before, the systemic pesticides that are applied so that they move inside the plant and that they can be available, particularly say on leaf tissue to protect the plant from herbivorous plants, well, those can result in residues that are available in the leaves or nectar later, sometimes much later, months or even years sometimes. And woody plants, shrubs and trees can express systemic pesticides for months to years after an application. This has been demonstrated a number of different times across different species. We took a look specifically ourselves at this question, and we teamed up with researchers at the University of Nevada in 2022, specifically to study milkweed plants. And so you probably are very familiar with milkweed. I know it's used to be really common, and I remember growing up and seeing it along the railroad tracks where I used to ride my bike in Chicago, and it's commonly found, or used to be, along fields and so on and so forth in the Midwest and many, many other places. It's the obligatory host plant for monarch butterflies. So we decided to go out and buy milkweed plants from nurseries across the country. We were looking at nurseries that were located sort of in the key flyways for the monarch, central, eastern, and western. And what we found was that the average milkweed plant contained 12 different pesticides. We found 61 pesticides overall across the entire study. We bought 235 different milkweed plants from I think it was 15 different states and 33 different stores. We found that it was more or less evenly split between insecticides and fungicides, but we did see several herbicides and also a synergist, which is often mixed in with other pesticides to make them more effective. And the range, the average was 12 per plant, but we found anywhere as few as 2 up to 28 different pesticides per plant. And I think the most surprising thing about this was that plants containing wildlife tags were more likely to contain fungicides that were actually at toxic levels for monarch. But what I will say is that the toxic effects of monarchs from what we found in these plants are mostly unknown because of the way our regulatory system works. Essentially, pesticides are regulated primarily on a few key species. EPA looks at species like rats and mice to try to figure out how it's going to affect humans. They look at the honeybee to try to figure out how it's going to affect bees, but also pretty much every other kind of insect. It's rare that they do testing. I mean, manufacturers might do testing for different kinds of butterflies or moths, because moths in particular often pest species on different crops. But the EPA doesn't require those kinds of tests. And so we don't have many tests of most of these insecticides on monarchs. We only had results for actually 9 of the 61. But what we did know is that we had some concerns about some fungicides. So going back to that issue, you know how sometimes you buy a plant and it's got a beautiful picture, perhaps maybe even of a monarch on it, and it says butterfly friendly or attracts butterflies or something like that. Well, oddly enough, we found that, I mean, this was a total surprise, but the plants that had those kinds of tags, they actually were twice as likely to contain fungicides at toxic levels. Across the study as a whole, 38% of the samples had concentrations of fungicides that have actually been associated with shorter wing length in monarch. We also found that many insecticides were at levels that, if we were examining nectar or pollen, the foods that bees ingest, we would consider those concentrations to be really, really high. Going back to that shorter wing length for monarch, the size of the wing has actually been correlated with the migratory ability of the monarch. So finding that fungicides were at levels that reduces wing length definitely raises concern. We already knew that fungicides are associated with negative effects on pollinators. There have been studies that have found associations between fungicides and reduced larval survival, also a lower weight of the pupae, and reduced adult longevity. These are all on bees. And fungicides also can slow down like we all have detoxification, mechanisms in our bodies, including bees. And so, we drink alcohol or something, we go sleep, our body sort of detoxifies that as long as our liver is working. And bees have similar internal physiological mechanisms. Don't ask me to tell you exactly how that works. But what happens when certain kinds of fungicides are mixed with certain kinds of insecticides, is that detoxification mechanism is inhibited. So fungicides are worrisome on a number of different levels. Even though a lot of times, many of us, including myself, we're paying a lot of attention to the insecticides, but we need to start thinking about fungicides on our plants too, especially because they're so commonly used in the nursery industry because of the high humidity in greenhouses. That plant disease is a real issue in the nursery trade. So let me go a little bit into other studies and what has been found. And this slide's a little bit technical, but I tried to organize it so that you can kind of follow along easily in a table. And I don't feel like, you have to get all of this, or, but I just kind of want to show some of the patterns that we see. Well, first, there was a study that was actually done in the UK. They took 29 samples of bee-friendly plants that were known to attract bees, and they screened them for 24 pesticides. And almost 100% of the plants had residues. They had a lower number of pesticides per plant, but they were not screening for as many chemicals. This was back in 2017. So that's getting to be 7, 8 years ago now. And they found that neonics, which are a certain kind of insecticides that extremely toxic at extremely low levels, they're found in this study in 70% of the plants. And between the neonics and this other insecticide called chlorpyrifos, those were found at levels known to harm bees through either growth, reproduction, or immunity. Then there was a study done across the USA. Again, the study focused on bee-friendly plants, but only bought from big box retailers this time. They took 71 samples. Half of the plants had residues. They were only screening for neonics here. So when they only screened for a small set of insecticides, they found that half the plants had residues. But of those, about 20% of them had 2 or more. And the combined concentrations were really high in the flowers, in some plants, well above the amount that is needed to kill a bee. And what was interesting is that the concentrations were almost triple this in the stems and the leaves, which is a pattern that we see sometimes, that there's higher concentration in leaves often than there is in flowers. It's not a hard and fast rule. It can vary, but sort of a rule of thumb. So Then in California, before we did our study that I just talked about, we did a similar study just in California, but we looked at milkweed across the landscape and picked, basically got milkweed samples from farms, from national wildlife refuges, from nurseries, and also from residential areas. For just the nursery milkweeds that we collected in that study, 100% of the plant had residues. The average number of pesticides per plant was 23, which is actually twice as many as we found in our more recent study, so really high. And there were 30 different pesticides detected across the study as a whole. In that case, when, we were just looking at a few big box stores where we were purchasing them from, but we found that if we compared them to the levels that are lethal for honeybees, which isn't a perfect match, but that's sort of the world that we live in, we have that data. We don't always have the data for monarchs. Basically, it showed that the plants could be pretty highly toxic for a few targeted insecticides, cyantraniliprole, thiamethoxam, which is a neonic. And then when we compared to levels that were lethal for butterflies and moths, leps, about 50% of the plants were affected with cyantraniliprole again, which is a kind of a common chemical in the nursery industry. Also, this other similar sounding chemical called chlorantraniliprole, and 18% for this new chemical called methoxyphenazide. I know this sounds very technical. I don't expect you to remember it, but essentially the takeaway is that we're seeing that nursery studies are showing us that we are finding a lot of pesticides in plants, and sometimes at levels that appear to be high enough to be causing problems for pollinators. The last row is just the study that I've already been talking about for the last few slides. So don't get me wrong. I am not trying to, malign the nursery industry or paint nursery growers as insensitive to pollinators or biodiversity. I've talked to so many growers and so many nurseries, and in looking at studies, this is my assessment of the factors that lead to pesticide use and residues on nursery plants. First of all, greenhouses, as I mentioned, they can really be conducive to pest outbreaks, not only fungal problems and bacterial problems, basic disease issues because of the high humidity and stuff, but also sometimes you can have an insect pest that can just like kind of explode inside a greenhouse because it's warm, it's moist, it's you've got this monoculture oftentimes, and it's really nice for sometimes certain pests. And nursery growers are concerned that customers won't buy their plants if they see plant damage or if they see insects on the plants. We call this sort of the cosmetic standard. And this is, we've all been acculturated that we have to have perfect plants. And this kind of leads to an overuse of pesticides. Interestingly, in looking at a particular study, that nationwide study, what I realized is that pesticides are really cheap compared to labor. When some researchers out of the University of Florida looked at nursery budgets, pesticides are 2% of their budgets, but labor is 26% of their budget on average. And so by asking nurseries to use less pesticide, we need to be sensitive to the fact that it could be a significant cost issue for them if it means that it's going to take a lot more labor. So again, it's just something to be aware of with, the kinds of typical bottom line pressures that are on any business. Also, interestingly, states and the federal government, they have laws in place to try to prevent invasive species and problem pests from crossing state lines, and nurseries are regulated under this, and nurseries that ship to other states often have to go through inspection and get special phytosanitary certificates and all of this. So they want to make sure that the sales are not held up in their shipments, and so they may apply extra pesticide just to make sure that their plants look perfect when the inspector comes by. Another reason is that, interestingly enough, nurseries can also use much higher rates per plant for some pesticides than what EPA allows in food crops. And I think this goes back to the human health thing. EPA, many people are maybe in the mindset like, well, need to make sure that people aren't going to get cancer from pesticides on our food, but hey, they're just putting it on plants. Like, people didn't used to think about bees and butterflies as much as they do now. They didn't really, we weren't really raised with this sort of more holistic ecological perspective. So that has led to this kind of skewing of the rates being higher in the nursery industry. Finally, there's not a lot of it's sort of opaque, just like, knowing what's been sprayed on your food that you buy in the grocery store can be kind of difficult. So it's difficult to dialogue often with the producer directly. And there's no national labeling rules. California does require that all growers and pesticide applicators that are not sort of like small residential people or something, but people who are licensed by the state, they have to report what they've used. So we can get some kind of insight into what is used in certain industries from the data in California, but oftentimes we just have to make educated guesses because of the opaqueness of all this. Okay. I clicked on advance, but it's not going. There we go. Okay, let's talk about solutions. We are committed to sourcing plants at Xerces that are safer for pollinators, and we know that that takes some work. So I want to share with you now just how we do that. But before we do, I hope you're admiring these beautiful milkweed pods in this beautiful photo. Really love this photo. So, I'm preaching to the choir here, but sometimes when I talk to other people, I tell them, focus on finding plants native to your local area from a local nursery who specializes in native plants. Again, I think demand is probably higher than it's ever been, and maybe we're starting to see more people growing. I know that sometimes these nurseries can be few and far between, but this is, an really important place to start, just from a basic, biodiversity sort of like perspective. Now, having talked to a lot of native plant growers, we can't assume that a native plant grower is avoiding harmful pesticides altogether, but I have found in my conversations that there are many native plant growers out there who are very careful about their pest management practices and their pesticide choices. But I encourage you and the people that you talk to take steps to better understand their practices through a conversation, because it's always a good idea not to assume that, because someone is growing, a native plant, that the plants are actually going to be safe. So we always recommend, whether you're a big buyer or a small buyer, whether you're just buying plants for your garden or whether you're, a purchasing agent for a landscaping company, we recommend that any large buyers especially take the time to learn about the nursery's growing and pest management and pesticide practices. We have these 2 publications at our website, each of which provides some information and guidance on how to do this. Buying Bee Safe Plants is geared a little bit more toward a casual consumer buying at retail. But large buyers might really benefit from looking at both of these, because large buyers are often buying wholesale or using brokers. So that gives larger buyers a great opportunity to have an in-depth conversation with the lead grower at the nursery, or sometimes the owner. And this takes some work and practice, but it's a step well worth taking. So we recommend that you include questions that probe their monitoring practices, like how they assess pest levels in their nursery, and their pest prevention practices, because prevention is more effective than trying to control a problem once it's there. Not just asking about which pesticides they use, because you only get part of the story that way. So in these fact sheets, we outline how to do that. And we hope that you use them because, getting a sense of the pollinator safety of your growers' pest management, it really provides some peace of mind. And it helps you to identify and favor those who are implementing the most solid and pollinator protective pest management programs. A further step that you can take is to set up a contract grow. And in this case, this is the kind of thing that can be done, again, if people combine efforts together, like maybe you've got neighborhood associations in your city and everybody's putting in pollinator gardens, you could potentially set up a contract grow for that. You could have a landscaping company set up a contract grow. But what is it? It's basically, I took this definition out of specialty trees, and it's many production nurseries offer. It allows landscapers, developers, designers to reserve plant material sometime before it is required, sometimes years in advance. So essentially, you go in, you set up a contract, and you pay a deposit, and you say, I want these plants, and these plants. But you can also say, I want it grown in this way, X, Y, and Z. So you can set the specifications and work with your nursery to get that. And it's a way to get assurance upfront that you can get the kinds of plants that you want grown the way you want. In a contract grow, the nursery is usually starting the plants from scratch for you, and that's what enables that. So at Xerces, our goal is to get plants that are what we call reliably safe, or basically finished plants that are free of pesticide residues that are most likely to result in harm for pollinators. It's not an absolute standard. It doesn't mean that no pesticide residues will ever be present, but it does allow us to be reasonably certain that the most concerning pesticides will be absent from our contract grown plants when we pick them up, or if they're present, that they'll be present at low levels only. So we developed this by looking at a list of all the different pesticides that nurseries could use, figuring out which were the most concerning. And we thought about those that are the most toxic to bees and to butterflies and moths, and about pesticides that could be more long-lived or persistent in or on the plants. Because again, if it's lasting a long time on the plant, you've got the chance that something's going to land on it, start to consume some part of the plant tissue, and maybe pick up a dose. Our contract growth specifications are specify that when we engage in a contract grow, we want the plants to be protective for bees, and that includes adult and larval bees and adult butterflies and their caterpillars. So we're looking at especially these groups of species, but we're looking at both the adult and the larval stage by looking at toxicity information that's been gathered on both the adult and the larval stages. So the specific provisions are that some pesticides are disallowed on the plants, soil media, or chemigation throughout the growing period. They're not allowed on the plants at all. And some pesticides are disallowed only 2 weeks before we take possession of the plants. These tend to be contact pesticides that are not going to last very long. And so when we pick them up, they are going to be mostly degraded by the time that we pick them up. So a little bit more detail, the ones that are disallowed entirely are 26 systemic insecticides throughout the production cycle. And then the ones that are disallowed for 2 weeks, it's several dozen other pesticides, certain insecticides and fungicides. As I said, mostly the kind that are toxic on contact, but not necessarily through ingestion, or they're not necessarily systemic. For 2 weeks prior to delivery, those are prohibited on the plants. So essentially, this eliminates the higher risk pesticides of concern, and it increases the safety of the plants at purchase. And what I talked a little bit earlier about talking to your nursery, which is another step that we take. So when we have these restrictions in place, together with the results of our interview with the nursery, which really gives us a lot of information about what their pest management practices are, together these steps help us support ecologically sound production. And I'm hoping that others will start to do this too. So let's talk a little bit about this step of approaching your nurseries. If you're thinking, maybe we could do this. I'm guessing, I don't know exactly who's in the audience, but I'm guessing it's probably not a lot of large buyers, but I could be wrong. But I encourage you to think about the large buyers in your community and talk with them about adopting this approach in their purchasing. This kind of approach does take some thought, planning, and a little bit of interpersonal skill as well. So let's talk through some of those steps. And when I talk about large buyers, like just going back, I think I mentioned at the beginning, but I mean, you can think creatively, but a large buyer might be a city, a large landscaping company, it could be a developer. It could be, groups of smaller buyers at sort of a neighborhood level. Could be retailers. So these are the kinds of ways in which leverage can be exerted through thinking creatively about how can you put into place sort of a large order. So the steps for that, what we recommend is first identify the likely nurseries who are producing the plants that you want. Who is producing the native plants in your area? What do they produce? Do you have any previous experience with them? Do you know a little bit about them? Who owns the nursery and what are their attitudes toward pollinator conservation and pest management? These are all good things to think about as you start to go in this. And then to educate yourself on common nursery challenges. I talked about that earlier on that slide about the factors that go into pesticide residues showing up on nursery plants, such as pesticides being cheap, compared to labor, and people not wanting to not have a perfect plant, So remember all that stuff as you approach, because this is not an easy thing to shift. We're talking about, we're not talking about turning a ship on a dime. We're talking about gradual change, and knowing that, we can approach as friends and, have it some empathy for what nurseries might be going through. And also they can listen to us about what we really want to see happen in our world. So the next step is to interview the head grower or the integrated pest management lead to better understand their general pest management practices first. And if they seem like a good candidate, you can then share the contract grower specifications by email and allow time for the nursery to review those against their current practices. And if you haven't heard from them, if that things just went silent, follow through. That's always a good practice. And maybe they tell you when you follow through, like, oh, this looks good and we think we can do most of it, but we have to use this when we have this particular pest show up, and it usually shows up on our willows or something, like you might hear something like that. Maybe you could consider a variance, because maybe it's not something that they need to use on all their plants. That pest might not even show up. But if they can produce even a subset of the plants they provide according to the specifications, it's definitely a step forward. And then sign a contract once all the details have been talked through and there's agreement on both sides. And we also have a step where we know that like things can come up while the plants are being grown. And so we invite the nursery, look, if something happens and you think you're going to lose this crop, please call us. We'll work it through, we'll try to figure out a solution, with you. We're not trying to be completely inflexible with this and rigid about it, but we are trying to sort of like push the nursery industry to think about growing without some of these most toxic chemicals throughout a lot of their growing season. And so that we can all have safe plants to put in our gardens and restoration areas. So, and finally, making it worth their while is always a good idea. As I mentioned, the larger the order, the more likely they are to maybe try to figure out how to make it work. And if you can quantify your reach, not only for this order, but future orders, like if you're working with someone who's buying plants on a regular basis and you can quantify that, the nursery may be more willing to make it work. Sometimes nurseries move to pesticides that are quote unquote organic pesticides that are not as long lived. They don't necessarily want to use those all the time because they might be really expensive compared to the pesticides that they have been using. But that might be something that they may be thinking about. Like if we had to, we could use this organic pesticide. I'm not saying that every organic pesticide is safe at all, but I know that a lot of them are not very long lasting. And so that's something that, and in any case, that, maybe something that they could use except for the last 2 weeks. Some of the pesticides that are on that list, on our list, are organic pesticides that they're allowed except for those last 2 weeks. Recognizing the nursery for their efforts in sustainability. If you find that you've created a really good relationship, they're producing the plants the way you want, is always great. People so appreciate that kind of recognition. You can also consider preferred vendor status if you're a purchaser who buys, with a lot of different vendors, and you have some way of providing preferred vendor status. And then resources and information about why it's important, I think, is appreciated. I mean, most nurseries, they're very aware of the pollinator question, but they don't always have all the details about the uses of the plants by, say, host plants for butterflies, or the ecological value sometimes of some different species, or the toxicological risk of some other of pesticides, particularly pesticides. So anytime you can share resources in a respectful way, that's appreciated. So yeah, that is all I had. And I just want to say thanks to all of our supporters. And thank you to Indiana Native Plant Society for inviting me here. And it was really great to be here with you tonight. And we invite you, if you want to join us as a member, because we can't do this work without people like you. And so there's a website if you decide that you want to do that. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and any contributions are tax deductible. And yeah, there's my email right there. If you think that you're interested in pursuing this approach, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you. And you can find me there at sharon.selvaggio@xerces.org. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sharon. That was so incredibly informative. That was a lot to take in, and it's a lot to think about. I'd like to start off the questions with my own. When you were talking about purchasing in nurseries and that sort of thing, we have INPS has a spring plant auction. It used to be in person, but since COVID has remained online. And we have a lot of people that are starting to grow locally that use practices that we support. A lot of our urban ag farmers or at least a few of them are starting to do native plants. And that's normally in kind of the plug sale, although we do have one grower who's doing like shrubs and in larger pots and stuff, which is exciting because they can be harder to find. And so that's a great way to get, locally sourced good practices and raising. But it doesn't do the advocacy part with the nurseries, which, was kind of a big part of your message tonight.
Yeah. Yeah, I think every nursery is different, and taking the time to, talk to them about their pest management practices is really important. Well, we've been doing that for quite a while, a number of years. More recently, as we introduce our contract growth specifications, and I finish an interview with a nursery and say, do you want to see what our specifications are if we enter into a contract grow with you? I haven't had anybody turn me down. They're very interested to see. And I have had people say, no, we can't do this. But we're having more nurseries jump on to growing this way every day. It's interesting. Sometimes there's only a couple of concerns that they have. But yeah, I think it's a powerful tool to sit down and talk with them and share some real specific, kind of guidelines for, we want these plants, but these are the pesticides that we don't want on them, and it kind of opens some doors, I think, for everyone to say, okay, I know what you're wanting now, and I think I can make this work, and it's an exciting kind of, approach, I think. Yeah.
Collaborative. Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that a lot. So you showed us some of the results from the 2017 study. Do you think that study might be replicated anytime in the near future?
The one from the UK?
Um, I think you had some in the UK and the US, some different
Yeah.
examples.
Yeah, the one from the UK, I mean, I can't speak to but for the one that first study in the US that was done looking at plants from big box stores and just testing for neonics, it was kind of a bombshell study. Like I think it really got the nursery industry's attention because they were talking about it, all over the place. And the issue of neonics was really coming up, and people started to really pay attention. And a number of nurseries just gave up using neonics altogether. We have seen that there are substitute chemicals that are being used that are not necessarily a whole lot better. They're also highly toxic. Those two iloprol compounds that I talked about, especially. Um, and we've got a concern about that because those of you who've been following pesticides maybe in this world, you might be familiar with this term pesticide treadmill. But oftentimes when one pesticide gets banned or people realize that it's dangerous, they just switch to a different chemical. And sometimes we don't always understand that chemical as well as we should. And sometimes we find out, oh, that wasn't a good, you know, substitute, that that actually is causing either different problems, or similar problems. And so what we really think is the best way is to support ecologically sound management that really allows pests to be taken care of as naturally as possible by having a robust natural enemy population, which is hard to do in greenhouses because greenhouses can be just very obviously very artificial environments. But a lot of growers who nursery growers who have their plants growing outside are often not dealing with as many pest issues because they've got the whole ecosystem kind of working on their behalf.
Mhm.
Anyway, I went off on a tangent there as far as
Mm-mm.
whether any of those studies will be
No,
replicated. Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, it would be interesting, to have that kind of, more work done.
it would be. Do you happen by any chance to know the funding source of that research?
The UK study, I think, was done out of a university. The study that was done on neonics at big box stores, that was um Friends of the Earth working with the Pesticide Research Institute in California. And they did a follow-up a couple of years later. And interestingly, as I said, I think it was such a bombshell study and the nursery industry really paid attention that they did find a really significant drop in neonic use even 2 years later because it had become such a conversation. But neonics haven't been dropped by the nursery industry altogether, especially when we're talking sort of commercial ornamentals. They're still used by at least 25% of the growers, according to a University of Florida study. So you can kind of start to understand like what's probably in the plants, either through residue studies on the plants themselves, or sometimes through asking nurseries, as some universities have done, like, what are you using? I didn't present the results of that, but there are some studies out there that have done surveys of nurseries and gotten some pretty detailed information about what nurseries are using and how often. So there's a lot of systemic insecticides being used by nurseries because a lot of the pests that they have, things like aphids, things like thrips, things like, you know, white flies and things like that, they suck on the plant phloem or xylem tissue, and the systemic insecticides are really good at killing off those kinds of pests. That's why, those systemic insecticides are pretty in high demand. And there are some, quote unquote safer systemic insecticides, but a lot of them we just don't have as much information on either right now. So
And so the takeaway from that, do I understand it correctly that a lot of the outdoor producers versus the indoor controlled environment producers, they have a lower need for pesticides because they experience less pest damage?
well, I want to be careful because I'm giving you some of my observations of based upon what people are telling me. It's not like empirical data that I've collected. And a lot of nurseries have a mix, like they're starting their plants in the greenhouse, and then they might open up the greenhouses as the season, becomes, conducive to it. Um, some nurseries are growing their plants 100% outdoors, and they just sort of go dormant in the winter. Um, it, my observation is that, and this is just an observation, is that it seems as though those that are utilizing open air techniques are more likely to not seem to feel the need for as many pesticides. But that's a very broad brush statement. And
And
yeah,
I understand that's a general
yeah,
statement. I will say
yeah,
that's what I see with our local growers, though,
yeah,
who
yeah,
aren't using any kind of pesticides and stuff, that they might, do seed germination in the controlled environment, but then they open up the high tunnel or take them outdoors,
yeah,
um, and they're not treating those plants. So it makes sense, but
yeah,
yeah, I understand your caveat. We've got
yeah.
one more question. I know we're getting close to the hour. But Josh asks, are there ways of testing plants for systemic pesticides without, I'm not sure what this means, mass spec or other big equipment? Are there other ways to test for it?
Um, I don't know a lot about like the actual mechanics of testing. What I do know is that it's costly, you know. Um, when I was just talking to my coworker because we just did a study using some kind of silicone bands to test environmental levels of pesticides in different cities.
Mhm.
And those were interesting, but it cost about 150 per band to, have analyzed. It used to be like with water samples, we would pay between 500 and $1,000. I don't know exactly what the cost was for a milkweed study because I didn't deal with that piece of it. There was a different person who was doing all that. But usually each sample is going to cost between 100 and $300. Just as a rough range. What kind of equipment exactly they're using, I'm not a chemist, so I don't know. But yeah, it'd be nice if it was easier and cheaper and accurate. We don't
And
want to listen.
accurate,
Yeah,
right. I think
yeah.
that we would all love to have an app on our iPhone or our
Yeah.
phone that could just scan a plant at the nursery
Wouldn't that be
and
great?
give us results. Wouldn't that be great?
Maybe
Um,
in 10 years, who knows?
that would be nice. That would
Yeah.
be nice. Well, we're 1 minute from the hour, so I just want to open this up to the group real quick. If there's any follow-up questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. We've got time for about one more, max. Well, Sharon, it's pretty quiet now. It's been a really great informative hour, and I really appreciate you taking the time to do this for us from all the way out there and on the West Coast in Oregon. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm sorry that I can't see most of you and don't, but I, I appreciate you being here. I know you're out there, and I hope you all have a beautiful spring and summer. And again, if you have any interest in this or want to talk more about it, don't hesitate to email me and we can set up a time to chat.
Okay, thank you. And to
Okay.
everybody, hopefully this recording, I'll send it to our editor tomorrow, if not tonight, and hopefully it'll be up on our YouTube channel. Just search Indiana Native Plant Society. And I know I'll be sharing it widely with some of my colleagues as well because it was a wealth of information. So Sharon, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Have a lovely evening, everybody.